still believed to be completely authentic. And Marcella said, well, I've got this diary, that my son, who took his own life, left behind. And I'm wondering if maybe you could help do the same thing for his diary that you did for Alice's diary. And, and but that book then, that diary then appeared as Jay's journal. And, Alden's diary, even Alden's original diary in its intact form was something, again, depending on how you count the entries, it was something somewhere between 90 and, 105 entries. All
right, today we are joined by Rick Emerson, who wrote the book with quite the title, Unmask Alice, LSD, Satanic Panic, and the Imposter Behind the World's Most Notorious Diaries. How are you doing, Rick?
I am good. How are you?
I'm doing well, and I'm always interested in people who are putting out fraudulent information, scams, things of that sort. Also, I'm very interested as of late, especially in the whole true story concept. And I don't know if you're familiar, in recent weeks, a show has come out called Baby Reindeer. And there is a huge amount of controversy with that show because it is a true story, not based on a true story, but a quote, true story. And you were writing about a book, Go Ask Alice, that came out in 1971 that was a true diary, quote unquote. I'm curious, though, before we get into any of this, I remember Go Ask Alice as a kid. 1971, it has been around. It's held up now for over 50 years. What do we have, 53 years?
53, yeah.
When did you first actually read the book yourself?
So I discovered Go Ask Alice, like a lot of people, when I was in high school, when I was a teenager. And I walked into the high school library, and there was, you walked in the front door, and on the right, there was a just returned shelf where it was like stuff that people had returned, but that they hadn't refiled yet. And it was sitting up there, and I saw the cover of Go Ask Alice, which is, by that point was already iconic. And it was sort of this half shadowed face of this girl. And it said, Go Ask Alice. And then below it, it's like those 5 words that I think, have just been an eternal lure for that book. It just said, a real diary by Anonymous. And I was like, oh, I got to see what that is. And I picked it up and I checked it out and I took it home. And I try to be a little bit suspicious of my own memories because, your brain is not like a video camera, despite what we like to believe. My memory is that I took it home and read it. And then I actually read it again because it's a fast read. And also it's gripping, and it was a fascinating story. And I read it a couple of times, and like everybody else, I was sort of like, it's an interesting story, but that was augmented, exponentially by the fact that it was presented as this true diary, and also by the fact that it was presented as a true diary, posthumously, that it was the diary of this deceased drug user. And, it's just unavoidable. That adds a lot of weight to it. That adds a lot of kind of gravitas, as they would say now. And, anyway, and so it's, so I would have been maybe 14 or so when I read it.
Now, would you agree, because I make the same argument with Baby Reindeer, I'll make it with Jay's Journal, I'll make it with Go Ask Alice, that the impact of it is that it was a real story or a real diary. If it was just
absolutely
put out as fiction, yeah, people might say this is a really remarkable piece of literature or whatever, but nobody would care that much.
Yeah, they would certainly care less. Obviously, people's lives can be changed and affected by things that are fiction or that are novels. I think everybody's probably read a novel or seen a movie or something that you went into it knowing it was fiction, and yet still it had this kind of visceral impact on you. But there is something different. I think there's 2 things. One, that it's a true story, presented as a true story anyway. And also that it was not just a true story, but that it was a true diary, because with a diary, leaving aside for a moment the issue of whether or not it's actually real. Just the whole idea of reading a diary is that you are presumably getting, when you're reading a diary, especially a posthumous diary, the sort of train of logic is that, well, I'm getting something that is not only real, but unvarnished because it was not originally meant for public consumption. So therefore, I'm not just getting this true story. I'm getting this true story this person didn't anticipate becoming public. So therefore, they're not shaping it for public benefit. I'm getting, the unvarnished truth. And that adds this whole other layer of weight. And I mean, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I will say that you are definitely correct when you say that it had more impact because of this perceived authenticity. And you only have to look at, at A Million Little Pieces, the James Fry book, which by all accounts, he had unsuccessfully pitched as a novel for quite a while. And it was unable to get, he couldn't find a publisher. And I can't say this for sure. And I think there's probably some NDAs at work with that story, but the generally accepted backstory that has now come out is that at some point, either his agent or his publisher, possibly both, said, but if this was less a novel and more of, a memoir, then we're talking. And and of course, that is what people gravitated to with that book, the idea that this astonishing story is also true. And it just added this whole patina of weight to it.
Yeah, this is a quick sidetrack, but you mentioned that book, so I'm going to throw one back at you that I think everybody should read, and that's Norm Macdonald, based on a true story.
I am reading that book right now. Right now, I'm reading that book.
Well, perfect. And he takes that whole phenomenon and just flips it on its head, quite literally, in that book. And it's a brilliant comic tour de force.
And it's a deconstruction of the kind of not just the memoir, but the celebrity tell-all memoir. And it's, it is one of those things that he, because of his persona, is able to pull off in a way that, I mean, honestly, I might find that irritating if it had been done less well or by somebody else, because it might just be sort of, it might feel shticky. But with Norm Macdonald, I mean, he was you could tell, I mean, from the beginning, I mean, you go back to all the way back to SNL and, and he clearly had so little tolerance for just the glossy sort of, as you say, tropes of not just show business, but the show business memoir, that when he's telling this, so when he's telling this, and I'm listening to the audiobook, which is actually, so you get to hear him say, and so then I was raised on a chinchilla farm by cowboys or whatever. And it's like, and he says it so deadpan, and you actually have to tilt your head a little bit and go like, what am I listening to right now? Anyway, but I'm a big fan of that book already.
Yes, and it is a giant shaggy dog.
Yeah, definitely.
Is.
And there are little bits of, of truth scattered in there. And in a way, it sort of tells, it serves as, at least, like I said, I'm only about halfway through, but it serves as this kind of meta commentary on show business and on what we expect from celebrities, and also, frankly, how predictable so many celebrity memoirs are.
Very true. Now, okay, so circling back, I listened to an interview, but I didn't quite get an answer. At what point was it revealed to you, or did you discover, or did you suspect? I'm going to, give you range here, that Go Ask Alice may in fact not be real.
I mean, I think it was probably I don't know if there was like a day where I suddenly went, hang on, but I think it was the process of just getting older. And I mean, I think as you get older, you get a little more reflexively, either skeptical or suspicious or cynical, possibly. And so I think part of that is just age. I think part of that is also, as you get older, and especially as we get into the age of the internet and all that, it's, you start to become just less trusting, because things that were once just widely accepted or would have taken a lot longer to be debunked, get debunked faster. And so, and also, I think, honestly, the fact that so much of Go Ask Alice is connected to the drug war and to the just say no style of the drug war, which I lived through. And so and so much of the, especially the Nixon through Reagan era of the drug war, was just based on things that, if they were not absolutely false, they were at least wildly embellished. And so that had this sort of ancillary effect, this sort of collateral damage of anything that seemed to be in concert with the drug war immediately seemed suspicious. And, and once you start looking at Go Ask Alice through those eyes, you start to see things that don't necessarily add up, things that are inconsistent. I would say that certainly by the time I was, 25 or 30, I think if you had asked me at that point, I would have said, well, this is probably just propaganda. This is just the man telling me what to think or whatever. I think I want to say when I was maybe 30 or 31, I wish I could remember when this happened, but I had a conversation with somebody where I'd arrived at this sort of pet theory about Go Ask Alice, which was, I don't know where I came up with this, but my sort of pet hypothesis was that it had been, this is what I thought at the time. I was like, well, I bet Go Ask Alice was this dual, it was this dual project made by like a Madison Avenue advertising agency and the White House. That the White House recruited like an ad agency to create this thing that seemed real but was really just anti-drug propaganda. That was their way of like injecting that into the culture. That was like their new way of combating drugs, which turned out to be like 10% true, but not really true. So that is a long way of saying, I don't know, probably between 25 and 30 is when I really arrived at what I felt was the correct answer about Go Ask Alice.
Okay, but which is cool, but you have to admit you put a lot of work into this book with some 300 some odd pages, ton of research. What was the impetus to say, not only do I think this isn't true, damn it, but I'm going to go after it? I mean, what triggered that?
I think a couple of things. One is that, I mean, I've always, and this has sort of been the case with me for as long as I can remember, I've always been really interested in I've never found the right term to describe this, but I describe it as the hidden history of everyday things. So I remember being, and I think a lot of people had this specific experience. I remember being a little kid and watching TV and watching sitcoms. And anybody who's my age or older knows that if you watch, an episode of MASH and an episode of Barney Miller and an episode of One Day at a Time, after a while, you start to recognize like specific laughs on the laugh track. You're like, this hollow chortle sounds familiar. I think I heard this on an episode of Different Strokes yesterday or whatever. And then it was like, well, what are these people? Who are these people on the laugh track? And what were they? Where did they tape this? And are they all dead now? And my mom, I remember we went shopping at a Woolworths one time, and there were like picture frames, and I was a little kid, and I was like, well, who are these people in the picture frames? And later it was like, who are these people playing on Muzak? When you're in an elevator and you hear, who's this guy playing the oboe on Ruby Tuesday by the Rolling Stones? And so I've always been fascinated by the behind the scenes. Like, here's the thing that's presented to the public. Here's the final product. The thing that always fascinates me is, well, what, I think Aaron Sorkin said one time, he said, the impetus for the West Wing, he said that he's like, I want to know the 15 seconds before and after the press conference. It's like the press conference is interesting. He's like, I want to know what happened off stage right before and off stage right after. And I have some of that. And so part of it was just, I think at the beginning, it was just the fact that at that point, almost 50 years had passed, 43 years, something like that. And there had still not been any sort of definitive answer about where this book came from, who actually, I mean, because if you look at the book itself, the only thing, apart from saying by anonymous, there's a note on the inside where there's a note from, quote, the editors, but they don't identify them by name. There's no indication who the editors were. And so that was really fascinating. And I do remember this actually from high school. I remember talking about this whole idea of the anonymous diary. And I was like, well, who wrote it? And my friend Heather said, she's like, well, nobody knows, it's anonymous. And I said, yeah, but who is it? And she said, well, and I think in her head, she was thinking, idiot. She's like, hey, idiot, like nobody knows. That's why it's anonymous. And, years later, I remember thinking, well, how can nobody know? Like, how can nobody know? I mean, as I think the character Lester Freeman said on The Wire at one point, he said, in this country, somebody's name is on a piece of paper somewhere. And so then it just became sort of an interesting kind of, I'm going to call it a scavenger hunt, but it was really intriguing. The idea that, that somebody somewhere, there is a backstory to this. And so the backstory to me is almost always more interesting than the actual thing. That's the first part. The second part is that having lived through the drug war, and especially, as I said, the sort of just say no part of the drug war, that then was kind of, that was then joined a few years later by the Satanic Panic, this sort of 15-year witch hunt that spread, across the country, and everybody sort of knows about that now. And it was certainly in my town. And what I didn't realize until years later was that both of these things, the drug war and the Satanic Panic, were both, if not started by, they were certainly accelerated by or exacerbated by this pair of teenage diaries, Go Ask Alice, and then this kind of similar book called Jay's Journal. And when I then learned that both of those diaries came from the same place, that they both came from this, this big house with blood red walls that was on the outskirts of Provo, and that nobody had really looked any further into it. At that point, it was almost out of my control. At that point, it was like this sort of like this like throttle had been thrown, and I was just kind of all in. I mean, there was just at that point I just kind of couldn't stop.
When did you find that out? Were you already working on the book, and then you ran into the Jay's Journal side of it? Because that's the second book, folks. By the way.
I had not read Jay's Journal. Jay's Journal was, I think, a lot more of a regional phenomenon. It certainly did not have the mainstream impact that Go Ask Alice did. It had, I think, in some ways, a sort of hidden or long tail impact, but that exceeded Go Ask Alice. But in terms of mainstream, in terms of just pure sales, for one thing, Jay's Journal didn't sell nearly as many copies. And it wasn't until I was, in my late 20s, maybe my 30s, that I started meeting people who had read Jay's Journal and knew a lot about it. And I started looking into it. And then I went home and realized that nobody else, I think the other thing is I assumed somebody else had written this book. It seemed impossible that I was the only one this interested. And so I was like, well, somebody has to have done this book already, which I think is how a lot of books begin, with somebody going like, well, this has to exist. And the more I looked, the more I realized it didn't exist. And it sounds a little glib, I guess, but it's also true that it was like, well, if I want to read this book, I guess I have to write it because it doesn't exist already.
Okay, question. Your angle going into the book, I'm curious. Was it, hey, there's this author who may well be a fraud, and she got away with essentially a giant con on the whole publishing world for decades? Or was it, there's this person and she was behind not one, but two moral panics, maybe even three if we roll in the AIDS, and you found that offensive and wanted to pry back the moral panic? Was that or did they discover?
It was more the former, I think, because until I really kind of got into this story, it had sort of been floating around for a while, that this is not as it is made to seem, that there's more here than meets the eye, and that there may have been, some distortion and some fraud. So I was certainly not the first person to sort of hear about that. But the idea of all of it kind of being linked, and that both of these things underscored, as you said, the sort of moral panics, I didn't really appreciate a lot of that until I got into the story. At the outset, I think for me, it was really just about trying to figure out, first of all, like, what is the process by which, Go Ask Alice, was created and sort of arrived in the marketplace, and what impact did it have? And also trying to sort fact from fiction about Jay's Journal. And as I got more into that, that's when I sort of realized it was like finding two houses on opposites, on different streets, then realizing that they had like this tunnel linking them underneath the surface. And once I discovered that, it was, and again, having lived through the Satanic Panic and recognizing so many elements of that were certainly amplified by Jay's Journal, if not necessarily created by it. I mean, it just became more, and it was like, I'm now just using every metaphor in the world, so I apologize, but it was just this thread that just kind of kept going and kept unraveling more and more. So I think it was just to scratch the curiosity itch at the beginning, and then it's the classic, if it was fiction, you wouldn't believe it. But it happens to be true, and it sort of astonished me that, that it hadn't been told yet. So, it started off as simple curiosity, and then became a lot of like, well, how far down does this particular tunnel go?
Where did you start?
I think I started the way that most people start most things now, is I got online and just went to Google or whatever, and started putting that in. And I used to have this page of notes that I made, and the notes were just a lot of like, still nothing. And because I just found it was like the same 5 sort of articles written and recycled like again and again and again. And the same kind of hardened opinions that were just sort of regurgitated over and over. And I think, when I started this book in 2015, at that point, I think by then there was this 4-page article from 1979 that was still at that point, still the most in-depth thing that had been written about Go Ask Alice and about Beatrice Sparks. So there just had not been a lot of in-depth writing about it. And so once I discovered that, I was like, okay, well, I gotta, I have to like start looking deeper. And fortunately, a lot of this was before COVID, which made it easier. I would have been incredibly difficult if I had been starting this like in 2019 or something. I don't know how that all would have turned out, but so then it was, switching from digital to analog. So then it was, calling people, which, itself that is one of those, if you really want to like feel the passage of time, it's realizing how easy it used to be just to look up somebody's, phone number in a book and just be like, 503. And now, finding somebody's phone number is a tricky proposition at best. Or writing letters to people, a lot of which just came back undeliverable or unopened. And then at a certain point just pouring through documents and archives, and then eventually going so far as to just kind of, a last resort was always to sort of go to like knock on somebody's door, which again it always feels a little bit weird, then just became totally untenable once COVID hit.
So you actually traveled to get a lot of your sources?
I did, especially because, so at this point, and I think a lot of this again changed during COVID, but when I went to Brigham Young University, and there's a lot of archives and whatever there, and I think a lot of colleges operated this way, where to look at a lot of their archives, because they have everything, pardon me. At that point, I think now you can do a lot of this online, but at that point, you had to fill out a form explaining who you were, what you wanted to see, what you were working on that, necessitated the access to these documents, because they have a lot of things that are valuable and irreplaceable. Then you had to have an interview with a special collections librarian, and the special collections librarian would interview you and then decide at that point whether or not you could have access to the archives. And the thing is, you had to do all of this in person. You couldn't do it over the phone. You couldn't fill out the application online. You had to do all of it in person. And so it was a question of like, getting a plane ticket and flying hundreds of miles and setting up an appointment, and all for the hope that this person would not then say like, nope, tough luck, go back home. Anyway, but fortunately I was able to do a lot of that because it was pre-COVID. And I think some of that's been streamlined now, but ultimately there's just, I think there's an illusion now, or it's easy to think because of the internet and the internet is an invaluable resource, don't get me wrong, but it's also easy to think that there's a temptation sometimes to think that if you look for, I spent 4 hours on Google and I couldn't find it. That just, there's a lot of stuff out there that's not on Google because it's in a box in a basement somewhere, or it's in a binder in somebody's house, or it's a photo in an album that's in somebody's attic.
Oh, I feel your pain. My wife is a library director, or was, she's retired. And she, one of her pet peeves is we don't need libraries. Everything's online.
That is not true. That is the furthest thing from, I would have been screwed on this story. And frankly, anybody who was trying to do any sort of serious research in something, we are rapidly approaching a point, and may already be there in some ways, where like seeing and hearing it with your own eyes is not going to be enough. And so there needs to be a canonical version of something in a way that is trustable and to whatever degree is possible, provable. And I do think going forward, I think libraries, that's a function they're going to serve. And libraries are going to play a huge role in saying, well, like, we can vouch that this is a canonical version of this document. Whether the document itself is accurate is a separate question, but we can tell you this is how the document originally looked. That's going to be crucial, I think, in the future.
There are forgers that are so good, and they can get the materials and the paints of the time and age them, and they're so talented that they can literally recreate works. And without that piece of paper saying, no, this in fact is the work, we know we've got a chain of custody from this person to this person to this person, much like evidence. I think that's kind of what you're describing.
It's like whenever I hear, it just makes my skin crawl whenever somebody says something like what you meant about, why do we need libraries now? And it's just like, I think I say this toward the end of the book in the author's note at the end. It's like, without libraries, this book would have been, would have taken a lot longer and not been nearly as good, and my childhood would have been unendurable. So yeah, we're on the same page.
All right, now let's talk about the woman of the hour. We're deep in the interview, and now we're going to finally say her name, Beatrice Sparks. But she's kind of an interesting character herself. How would you describe her at a cocktail party?
So Beatrice Sparks was the woman behind Go Ask Alice, and other anonymous teenage diaries. She always presented herself as the editor of Go Ask Alice and the subsequent books. She was, a very conservative. She was a Mormon, a Latter-day Saint, married mother of four who lived in Provo, Utah. She was head of the local Republican Women's Coalition and was very much an established member of that society. And by the time Go Ask Alice came out in 1971, she had been, really working to make it as an author, to break through for several decades. And Go Ask Alice was, despite the fact that her name was not on it, was her big breakthrough, and it came when she was 54. And and again, she always really presented herself as the editor of that book, and then of many subsequent books that came out that all bore a striking similarity to Unmask Alice. That's a long cocktail party answer, but yes, that's
No, that's fine. Oh, one of the things interesting about her is she made a lot of claims about herself, her educational background, her profession, and down the line. So, to be explicit, she called herself Dr. Sparks, if I recall, PhD. So she claimed that she had a PhD and that she worked as a clinician or something of the sort, because did she not say that she spoke to people in her practice and that's where she compiled some of these stories?
Yeah, like many other people, both well known and not, she had a real knack for reading the room, and I guess a charitable, relatively speaking, a charitable sort of telling is that she had an ability to read the room and kind of tell people what they wanted to hear, what they needed to hear in the moment. I think a less charitable to her, again, this is all relative, reading of this is that she was just incapable of telling the same story twice, because, as you said, the credentials seem to change almost at random, and her background and experience seem to change almost at random. While there are some while there are some things that I guess could be quantified as spoilers that I'll try to sort of step around, it's not a spoiler to say that, because I say this almost on the first page of the book, that, depending on the day or the setting in which you spoke to her, she would either be a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a psychoanalyst, sometimes just a counselor, sometimes just a therapist. And a lot of those terms, are a little bit flexible. But it seemed to waver depending on the day and the moment. And also, those claims, as is often the case, they inflated over the years. It was just like so many mushrooms on a lawn. The number of degrees and the number of, the amount of experience just seemed to multiply almost beyond control in the later years.
Okay, well, I won't hide the ball, because this isn't Conversations. I just opened Amazon right now,
Sure.
and I'm up, and here's a book called Finding Katie, and is edited by Beatrice Sparks, PhD.
Yep.
Annie's Baby,
Yep.
Beatrice Sparks, PhD. It Happened to Nancy, Beatrice Sparks, PhD.
Treacherous Love.
Treacherous Love, there you go, Beatrice Sparks, PhD. I could go on.
Yeah.
That's a very specific claim.
Yep.
In print. If you give somebody your name and then you put PhD behind it, you're making a strong claim.
Absolutely.
Unless you got an honorary degree somewhere, which I always think is a sketchy claim, and that's possible. Did you find any records whatsoever that she had a PhD or even a lower level degree from anyone?
nobody in my life has ever once said, show me your high school diploma. It's like if you say you have a high school diploma, I mean, unless you're going to become an architect or a heart surgeon or something, nobody's ever once said, show me your diploma. And one of the things that I discovered, even having gone through the publishing process once before, I just sort of assumed that at some point there was somebody somewhere who just had to sign off on things like this, who just had to verify, who had to, for lack of a better term, who had to fact check stuff like that.
Mhm.
And it turns out that's not really the case. And I mean, you do get the sense, as you said, there are people with honorary degrees. I mean, that becomes a whole different thing when you are positioning yourself as a clinical psychologist, much less a clinical adolescent psychologist or a child psychologist. And you are publishing books that are presented, I mean, as you said, barefacedly, presented as being genuine, as being authentic. And they're about very serious topics. They're about anorexia. They're about AIDS. They're about date. And that becomes the consequences, and the fallout from that becomes a lot more severe. But no, I didn't find any evidence of that at all.
Okay, so I'm going to go further than that. Because she made claims that she met these people in her clinical work.
Clinical practice, yes.
Clinical practice, thank you. Did she ever have an office, a location, any proof of patients?
No, and there was no evidence of a license ever being issued or anything like that. Beatrice Sparks was not shy about touting her own achievements and her own accomplishments, which is no sin in and of itself. I mean, that's, she was in many ways, leaving aside the fallout from a lot of her work. I mean, she was like a lot of people of her generation. She was, she lived through a lot and through the Great Depression, and she was very much a self-made person in some ways. And, and so she was justifiably proud in some ways about the things she'd accomplished. And so she was never shy about, laying out exactly what she had done and what she'd achieved and the impact she'd had on the world.
Okay, and the reason why I'm hammering this so hard is because, in essence, a third-party observer could easily, I'll just put it that way for legality's sake, say that she's a complete fraud.
Yes, you could say that.
And this becomes important. Now, the Go Ask Alice story, obviously, is the start of it. It's the bigger book and things like that. But I actually find it less problematic in some ways than the later book, Jay's Journal.
Yes.
And maybe that's because I lived through it firsthand. And some things, like Go Ask Alice, may have exaggerated things, but I'm not going to sit there and say that drugs are good. Right. Drugs are bad. Drugs do destroy lives.
Yes.
Those are facts. And in a perverse way, if Go Ask Alice, and you did bring up some people whose lives were changed by the book, who said, because they had that, they saw what was going on, it turned them off. They never did drugs. And I believe you mentioned a specific person who actually discovered she had a lung condition, and had she started doing drugs, she may well have,
Yeah, her name is a young woman named Morgan, who lived in Nebraska, and she discovered Go Ask Alice. And this is one of those things that people say, well, in 2000, whatever, like, how could anybody possibly believe that this is? And I mean, I think she discovered Go Ask Alice in 2010 when she was 12 years old, I think. So she was born in 98. So that sounds right. So, but yeah, she discovered Go Ask Alice and read it. And because of Go Ask Alice, stayed clean and sober, and to my knowledge has remained clean and sober. And yeah, and then years later, they discovered that she has myocarditis, I believe is what it's called. I'm doing this from memory, but it's this abnormal thickening of the heart muscle. And what they discovered is that if she'd done serious drugs in any serious amount, might have killed her on the spot. She didn't know that at the time. Nobody knew that at the time. They thought it was asthma. But inadvertently, by reading Go Ask Alice and staying clean and sober, I mean, it is indisputable, to me at least, that Go Ask Alice has saved lives. I mean, it's just, to me, there's just no way around that, because there are people, and I've talked to a lot of people, and I mentioned, as you say, some of them in the book, who either got sober or stayed sober because of Go Ask Alice, or people who were able to survive. There's any number of people who grew up in a house with addicts, addicted parents or siblings, who were able to navigate that a little bit more because they felt like they had this kind of window into addiction and to how helpless people can sometimes be in the grip of addiction. And it gave them a little bit of empathy or sympathy at least, it is indisputably true, as you said, that, that drugs can destroy people and do destroy people, and they destroy families, and they can, they can be in their own way, in some contexts, they can be a help or innocuous. In a lot of other contexts, they can be an unalloyed destructive evil. But Go Ask Alice, as you said, also paved the way for this sort of sibling book called Jay's Journal, which had, a much more tangible, damaging fallout. Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely want to go into that, and that's why I wanted to get both sides of Go Ask Alice. Like, obviously, it's very fraudulent in a lot of the ways it's written, very questionable, all of that. But it's one of those that if somebody came up to me and they said they feel like the book itself may be a net positive, I'd have a hard time arguing with that.
That is absolutely true. In fact, I actually printed this out. Let's see if I've actually got it here or if I left it on my printer. I might have left it on my printer, but there's a thing that happens at the Library of Congress for years, did this thing called the Letters About Literature program. And again, I think it's now the states all do it separately, but what it is it's for high schoolers, and you write a letter. I mean, people have done this sort of thing for years. It's where you write a letter to either an author or a character from a book, and it could be a fictitious character, it could be living or dead, and you just write a letter to them, an open letter to them, just saying, how they affected your life. So, so somebody could do it to, Jane Austen. Dear Jane Austen, your books have really been a source of pleasure to me. Or Dear Holden Caulfield, I read Catcher in the Rye, and after reading your character, I felt less alone, or whatever. And this happens every year. And just this year, so the 2023-2024 school year, the winner of I don't know if they still call it Letters About Literature, but the winner of this contest they do every year from Oklahoma was a young woman who wrote a letter to Beatrice Sparks about Go Ask Alice. And that is just this year. And she wrote this 2-page letter, which is really one of those letters that it's sort of crushing and kind of inspiring at the same time. And not to belabor the point, but in the letter, she just says, she talks about how she was born to a mother who was an addict, and that when she was 9 years old, when the young woman was 9 years old, her mom finally gave her up for adoption, which is a thing that normally does not happen to an, she went into the foster system and then was adopted, and her mom had to sign the paperwork letting this family adopt her. And she says, she's like, for years, I was so angry at my mother because I couldn't understand how a mother could possibly give her daughter away for adoption at 9 years old. How could you do that? And she's writing this in a letter to, to by now the late Beatrice Sparks. And she says, having read Go Ask Alice, I now have maybe something of an idea of what my mom might have been going through, because she's still an addict. And so this gives me a little bit of a window into how trapped and helpless my mom might have felt, and how hard but necessary it might have been for her to sign that paperwork to let me be raised by somebody else. And, and she said, because of Go Ask Alice, whatever anybody wants to say about Go Ask Alice, look, that book will outlive us all. I will be long gone, and people, teenagers especially, will be reading Go Ask Alice because it has this emotional truth to it. And there's value in emotional truth, I think.
Okay, so now let's go to where we can be critical, in my opinion.
Yes.
There's a diary or journal that was written by an Alden Barrett. And I did want to ask you if Alden Barrett was perhaps influenced by Syd Barrett of Pink Floyd when he went through all his troubles. But Alden Barrett was a young man who did actually use acid, apparently. Did have a rough time. He felt trapped in a fairly conservative environment in Utah, kind of small town kid. Just got into trouble, like a lot of young males, quite often, especially. But he was sort of a troubled youth, was trying to get his life on track, was in a relationship with somebody, and tragically ultimately took his own life. And it's just I don't want to say it's a pedestrian story, because it's obviously a monumental story to him and his family, but it is not a story that hasn't been told before or something similar. Would that be
Well,
fair?
it's a common story. It's a story. It's a relatable story that I think versions of it, maybe with a less tragic outcome in many cases. I look. I mean, everybody. I mean, you could not pay me enough to be a teenager again. There is no amount of money. There's just no in this era or any era. You could not pay me enough. People are like, high school. Those are the best years of my life. It's like, well, good for you. That was not the case for me. In some ways, Alden Barrett's story is a stand-in for what a lot of people go through when they're teenagers, and this sort of takes unexpected turns afterward. And it's but I think in the same way that Go Ask Alice is, the character of Alice is relatable to people because it has this emotional honesty to it. I think, Alden Barrett's story resonates in some ways, certainly with me, for a lot of the same reasons. It was, he was, the thing that a lot of teenagers go through, where you're just like, nobody understands me. My parents don't understand me. I want to get out of this tiny little one-horse town and go someplace, where people are like me, with people who think the way I think.
To be fair on that, a lot of it is a compression if you consider the fact that he was 16, 17, whatever. High school's 4 years. If you
Yeah.
consider somebody's 18, that's almost a quarter of their life because you don't remember anything really before you were 3 years old or so. Now, if you take puberty into the question, you're talking about what, 12, 13, depending on the age, your lifespan now is compressed at that point to you've only existed for 4 years, 5 years. So everything is obviously much more heightened. A month counts for a lot. A year counts for a monumental amount. But his story alone, just as we described it, which is pretty similar to his actual diary,
Mhm.
is a very fair, relatable, compelling piece of work. However, it appears it wasn't enough. And the book that came out from the diary was something called Jay's Journal. And can you describe how that basic story that we just told, I forgot what you said in the final book, it's like 21 entries
And
versus a
it's
hundred some odd.
it's like 23 entries, something like that, because some of them are undated, so it depends on how you define an entry. But yeah, about 2 dozen entries. Yeah.
Okay, so there were 2 dozen entries approximately that were an actual diary. And then somebody, because remember, she found it,
Yes.
somebody embellished this and added either completely new entries or they took the where an entry stopped and apparently continued the entry with a whole lot more information that
Yeah.
on a
So
wild ride.
so what happened with Alden Barrett, who, I think all the evidence and everything I have ever read and everybody I've ever talked to about him and everything indicates that he was a troubled but fundamentally good-hearted teenager who, certainly not perfect, certainly trying to better himself, but ended up taking his own life, as you said, and he left behind a diary, an actual diary. It was found after he died. His siblings found it, and his mother sort of looked at it and was like, well, and she read through it, and by this point, his his parents had been struggling to understand what was going on, with his sort of emotional and mental kind of turmoil, and they had done their best to try to help him. But mental health, especially for young people, was very much on training wheels at that point. And so, but they had this diary, and Go Ask Alice comes out, and Go Ask Alice, which again is presented as this edited but authentic diary of this deceased teenage girl, and so Alden Barrett's mother, Marcella, has this journal, and she eventually reaches out to Beatrice Sparks, who by that point, who a few years later had sort of outed herself as the quote editor of Go Ask Alice, which again, at that point, everybody, still believed to be completely authentic. And Marcella said, well, I've got this diary, that my son, who took his own life, left behind. And I'm wondering if maybe you could help do the same thing for his diary that you did for Alice's diary. And and but that book then, that diary then appeared as Jay's journal. And Alden's diary, even Alden's original diary in its intact form, was something, again, depending on how you count the entries, it was something somewhere between 90 and 105 entries. Jay's journal comes out, and Jay's journal, I think, is 212 entries, and only 20 some which, 24 of which are taken from Alden's actual journal. And so the other 190 or whatever are just from nowhere. They just appear out of the blue, and they are vastly different than the rest of the writing. And they, essentially depict him as being this teenage satanic sociopath, as just this unhinged teenage monster who didn't kill himself because of depression or because he was frustrated with his home life or because he'd had this unhappy breakup with a girlfriend. In this new telling, it was all because of Satan. Satan had lured him to the dark side, and he was, in the end, literally possessed by a demon. That's what Jay's journal would have you believe. That he was literally possessed by a demon named Raoul, and which, it should be stated, strange credulity. And so that is one of those things when you asked me a while ago, like, how I felt about some of the story as I got deeper into it. It is one of those things that, even if you try to give a generous reading of some of the things that Sparks did in her career, even if you try to make a lot of allowances for the good that may have been done by Go Ask Alice, it becomes increasingly difficult, not to be alternately depressed and outraged or simultaneously depressed and outraged, by the story and by what Alden's actual real life struggles, which were significant. They were commonplace. They happen to a lot of people. Mental and emotional, illness or upset. Those are, as we all know now. I think we've learned a lot about mental illness and a lot about emotional health in the last few decades. And, we know that that is a thing that a lot of people, if not most people, go through for at least some period of their life. And, there's no need to augment that or to just add, those things that's already, a serious, weighty and compelling thing to write about and talk about without adding a lot of and then his cat was possessed by the devil, which appears at some point in the book. So it just becomes ludicrous and angering all at the same time.
It was a smear. Some of my audience gets annoyed with it, but I've had Ken Lanning on, who was head of, they called it the behavioral science unit, and they called it another name. There's two names. He was there during the time that changed over from one name to another, worked with John Douglas at the FBI. And a lot of the quote satanic panic came out of this. Now, as a kid who grew up, I liked heavy metal some, listened to it. That was fine. I didn't like being told what I couldn't listen to. I didn't want to hear all that. I played Dungeons and Dragons. I think the ultimate irony, and I like the term moral panic, because I feel like moral panics can come from the right and they can come from the left. People can get a little bit crazy whichever way you go. And that's a side note. But the whole Alden Barrett story led to a lot of absolute madness, or if
Absolutely.
the madness was already starting, it was served as another real book about a boy who was really possessed, and this really happened. So a lot of people were terrified that their own children were going to be possessed by the devil because of a fraudulent piece of work, not to mention what incalculable damage that had to do with his family, who were already suffering the loss of their son.
But yeah, one of the things that happens in this saga again and again is, the sort of terrible, and a thing that I can't even begin to imagine, because I do not have kids. But when you read about the impact on families of, when a child commits suicide, and the sort of immediate fallout, and then the ongoing permanent fallout of that, and all of the sort of, all of the damage that can wreak, not just in the short term, but just, for the rest of the life, and in fact sometimes beyond the life of the people around that person. And so in the case of Alden Barrett, you've got his parents who, again, were, did their best, were flawed and imperfect in a lot of ways, and could have made different decisions, but at the same time, were operating with the information they had and the information that was available at that time to the general public about mental health and all that. And we're also operating inside a very, very conservative, extremely religious culture. I mean, I think they were, so they're in Pleasant Grove, Utah, which I think at the time, and this is from memory, but I think at the time it was like 98% Latter-day Saint, and I think it's still far above, 85% now. I think it's 92 or 93%, but, and that comes with all of its own sort of strictures and baggage. But they go through this horrible, one of the things that happens when a child commits suicide is the parents do this compulsive and obsessive self-interrogation of what did I do wrong? So they're not only going through this, but then you fast forward to when Jay's journal comes out, and now it's that they've kind of failed him again, even in death. Even after his death, they've failed him again, and they've failed to save him a second time. And now it's not just his physical life that is destroyed. Now it's the sort of memory, his image that is destroyed and publicly destroyed.
Right. And I'm not going to go any deeper on that, but then she continued with story after story after story. I think the Jay's Journal is the high point of the worst, in my opinion. But she did plenty of damage and many other books beyond. She found a lot of diaries and put out a lot of books. But to wrap things up, I always like to ask one question. And it is, you could look at it two ways. Either, what is the one question I should have asked you, but I neglected to? Or what is the one question you've been waiting for somebody to ask you, but nobody seems to come up with it?
I think the one thing that a lot of people, pick up this book, looking for or thinking about, because they're his, 53 years later, there is still so much. I mean, Go Ask Alice is still a big seller. It's still, and in fact, if you go on, just like Amazon's probably the easiest, you go on Amazon and read the reviews, like the recent reviews for Go Ask Alice. I mean, from the last 6 months or so, you'll find that, I mean, every time I do that, which I don't do that often anymore, but if you go look at the reviews for Go Ask Alice, you'll find that there's still a pretty big split in terms of how people view that book. There's a lot of people who are like, this is absolute hogwash and it's just made up. There are a lot of people who are like, this story it's a real diary. It's absolutely true. There's no doubt this happened. And a lot of people are like, well, I just don't know. But there's kind of a split there. And, for a long time, especially in the early days of Go Ask Alice, there was this whole question about, was there really an Alice? Did she really exist? And, going into this whole project, I certainly, as we said at the very beginning, I'd come to the conclusion that there was no Alice. This is like absolutely made up. This is just pure anti-drug, hogwash, just made up, whole cloth. And I don't want to be too coy about it. I will say that there's nothing worse than just, spending hours and hours reading or watching something, and at the end they just shrug and go, who knows? So there is an answer. By the end of the book, I sort of lay out the broad strokes, of what actually happened, and it was sort of unexpected. It's not what I anticipated finding. It does make sense in the larger structure of the book. But as you said, more than anything, it's just this overall escalation, and how, in terms of publishing and in terms of society, and how all of these panics sort of coalesce and they come to a head, over and over again, and as Mick Jagger says, sometimes you feel like there is no present, there's only recycled past. So this book, I think, kind of illustrates that to some degree.
And yet one person who surfed the moral panics to have a very interesting career.
Yes, it did absolutely pay off for some people. There is no doubt about that.
All right, well, Rick, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was a fantastic interview. It was a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.